The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversations, the occasional clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft shuffle of footsteps over the polished wood floors. It was the kind of place where the city's elite gathered, tucked away behind unmarked doors and velvet curtains. The lighting was just dim enough to feel intimate, and every detail had been curated for an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. In a corner booth draped in cream-colored linen, the billionaire sat with an entourage of two men and a woman, all impeccably dressed, all laughing too hard at his jokes. His presence drew attention. Not for the first time, his name had been whispered between tables as other guests noticed his arrival. His reputation preceded him, ruthless in business, unapologetic in his arrogance, and known to treat service workers as though they were invisible until they made a mistake. That night, he was in a particularly abrasive mood. The waitress assigned to his table was a young black woman, maybe in her early 20s, with neatly braided hair pulled into a bun and a name tag that read Jada. She moved with efficiency and grace, balancing trays and smiling through each interaction. When she approached the billionaire's table, she greeted them warmly and took their drink orders without hesitation. At first, he barely looked at her, brushing off her attempts at pleasantries. But when she returned with the drinks, something about the placement of a lemon wedge on his cocktail seemed to ignite a spark of disdain in him. He stared at the glass as if it had offended him personally, then looked up at her with a sneer. "You call this service," he said, his voice raised just enough to be heard by neighboring tables. "Is it that hard to get something this simple right?" Jada blinked, caught slightly off guard, and glanced at the glass. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, reaching for it. "Would you like me to?" "I would like you to do your job correctly the first time," he interrupted, his tone laced with mockery. "Or is that too much to ask? Maybe they're just handing out aprons to anyone these days." The laughter at his table paused awkwardly. The people with him glanced around, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. A couple at a nearby table froze mid-conversation. Jada's hand, still resting on the edge of the tray, trembled slightly, but she didn't move. Her lips tightened, but her composure remained. The billionaire, sensing he had everyone's attention, leaned back with a smug grin, as if to savor his dominance over someone who couldn't talk back. But she still didn't retreat. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye, steady and calm, her expression unreadable. The room had grown unusually quiet. Conversations had faded, forks stopped clinking against plates. The tension was thick enough to cut. Jada stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle before she finally opened her mouth to speak. The words she chose didn't come out in anger or humiliation, but with a deliberate clarity that carried through the space like a perfectly struck note. As she spoke, eyes widened and heads turned. The billionaire's smirk faltered for the first time all evening. His companions shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the maitre d', who had been halfway across the room, stopped walking mid-step. For a moment it felt like time had paused. The weight of what had just been said was still landing, word by word, on every ear within range. People looked at Jada not with pity, but with something closer to admiration, a quiet recognition that what had just taken place wasn't merely a confrontation, it was a shift. Not loud, not theatrical, but sharp enough to draw blood without a blade. She didn't move. The billionaire didn't speak. The other diners began whispering again, but not the way they had whispered when he walked in. The energy had changed. No one seemed eager to return to their risottos or foie gras. At one table near the bar, a woman muttered, "Good for her," loud enough to be heard. A man in a business suit lowered his fork and shook his head. The billionaire's jaw was tight, his eyes darting from face to face, trying to gauge how many people had just witnessed what he clearly hadn't expected, not just defiance, but control. Real control, the kind he didn't own, the kind that couldn't be bought or silenced with a check. Still, Jada didn't look away. She didn't flinch or apologize. She didn't need to. She didn't need to explain herself. But what she said next carried a weight that no one expected. Her voice was even, almost soft, but it didn't waver. She looked directly at him, not with anger, not even with defiance, but with something colder certainty, the kind of certainty that doesn't need permission to exist, the kind that can't be shaken by wealth or titles or the echo of someone shouting across a linen-covered table. And then she said it. Just one sentence that cut straight through the noise of money and power and performance. If someone talked to your mother the way you just talked to me, what would you do? It wasn't shouted. It wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. It landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples outward that reached every corner of the restaurant. The billionaire blinked. For the first time that night, he looked truly uncertain. His lips parted, maybe to speak, but no sound came out. His face tightened, as if his mind was scrambling for a response that wouldn't make him look even smaller than he suddenly seemed. His hands, previously spread in smug superiority on the table, curled slightly into fists. The woman sitting next to him inhaled sharply, her hand halfway to her wine glass. She didn't touch it. The man on the other side of the booth tilted his head and studied Jada like he was seeing her for the first time. Around the room no one moved. Eyes locked on the scene with a kind of hushed awe, the kind you might feel when something sacred or irreversible is happening. Jada stood tall, still holding the tray, her uniform neat, her expression unchanged. She didn't follow up. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to, because what she'd said had already opened a door no one else had thought to walk through. She had shifted the ground under his feet in a way that no financial power could correct. It wasn't a question meant to invite discussion. It was a mirror held up in public, a mirror that dared him to look past his wealth, past his ego, past the walls that money usually built to keep these moments out. And in that mirror, the reflection wasn't flattering. The silence that followed stretched on. People weren't just watching now, they were leaning in. They were remembering their own mothers, their own daughters, the women they knew, and the way they'd been spoken to. A man in a booth nearby nodded slowly. A server at the edge of the room, holding a pitcher of water, stopped pouring. The maitre d', frozen in place near the entrance, now took a cautious step forward, but didn't interrupt. No one wanted to break the moment. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even long, but it was honest, and the thing about honesty, real, quiet, deliberate honesty, is that it leaves no room to hide. The billionaire, for all his bravado and power and tailored suits, suddenly looked very small. Like someone who had spent years building a persona that couldn't withstand one truth spoken plainly by someone he tried to diminish. The restaurant hadn't changed. The candles still flickered, the silverware still gleamed, the music still played somewhere in the background. But the atmosphere was different now, like the air itself had taken sides, like respect had entered the room and decided where it belonged. And it wasn't at his table. Jada didn't blink. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't soften the blow. She had asked a question he wasn't prepared to answer, not because it was complex, but because it was simple. Because it required humanity, and for a man so used to bending the world to his will, being asked to step into someone else's shoes, someone beneath him, someone serving him, was a demand he didn't know how to meet. He looked down at his drink. The lemon wedge no longer seemed important. His voice, once booming and theatrical, was gone, replaced by a silence that he couldn't control, replaced by a roomful of eyes that no longer saw him as a man to admire or fear, but one to examine, to measure, and maybe to dismiss. Jada turned her gaze briefly toward the other diners, not to seek validation, but as if acknowledging their presence for the first time. They had been spectators. Now they were witnesses. Something had happened here, something that wasn't about a cocktail or a mistake or a man's temper. It was about dignity, and everyone knew it. The shift in the room was almost physical now, like a subtle tilt in gravity that everyone felt at once. What had started as a man lashing out over a drink had become something else entirely, something heavier. People weren't just watching anymore, they were reacting. And it wasn't with the kind of distant curiosity you give to a passing conflict between strangers. It was personal, it was visceral. The power dynamic had flipped so quietly, so cleanly, that it took a moment for most to even realize it had happened at a table near the windows. A woman in a dark blue pantsuit slowly set down her fork and folded her napkin. Her expression was unreadable, but the way she looked at Jada carried weight, a kind of silent recognition, like someone who had been on the receiving end of a similar moment and knew exactly what it cost to stand tall through it. A few feet away, a couple exchanged glances. The man gave the faintest nod in Jada's direction. The woman across from him placed a hand over his without a word. People began murmuring, not loudly, but steadily. You could hear pieces of conversations. Did you hear what she said? That was powerful. He's not used to being talked to like that. One by one, people became more than passive observers. Some sat up straighter. Some leaned in. A young server walking past the billionaire's table stopped and looked at Jada, her eyes wide with something like admiration, then glanced at the billionaire as if seeing him through a different lens. One of the busboys near the back corner whispered something to a colleague and pointed subtly, not at the man in the expensive suit, but at the woman who had stood her ground. It was happening without coordination, without noise, without protest signs or megaphones. Just people noticing, feeling, choosing how to see what was unfolding in front of them. A small but unmistakable current of solidarity was sweeping through the room, slow and silent but undeniable. It wasn't just for Jada, though she was at the center of it. It was for anyone who had ever been humiliated in a space where they were supposed to remain quiet. It was for anyone who had ever had to smile while someone spoke to them like they didn't matter. And for once, in a place where money usually determined who got to speak and who had to listen, the power of one quiet sentence was being amplified by the people who chose to remember it. The billionaire was still seated, his eyes now darting not just between the people at his table, but around the room. He could feel it too. The attention had slipped from his grasp. The narrative was no longer his to control. He looked to his companions for support, but found none. The man on his right was looking away, suddenly fascinated by the wine list. The woman next to him was staring at her phone, avoiding eye contact. Their silence wasn't loyalty, it was distance. The kind of subtle retreat that people make when they realize they're standing next to a sinking ship. Jada hadn't moved, but she didn't have to. Her presence now carried something beyond her role. She was still wearing the same uniform, still holding the same tray, still in the same posture, and yet she had become something larger, not loud, not angry, just undeniable. The chef, visible for a moment through the open kitchen doors, paused what he was doing and walked out toward the service counter, his brow furrowed, eyes scanning the room. He didn't speak, but the way he looked at Jada told its own story. He knew something had happened, something real. A man in a gray sweater at the bar tapped the rim of his glass, then pointed casually at the waitress by the billionaire's table and said, "Send her my compliments. That was the best thing I've seen all year." His bartender smirked, nodded once, and did as told. Even the music playing faintly through the overhead speakers seemed to fade for a moment, or maybe people were just listening more closely now, listening in a way that didn't happen every day. Because they knew they had witnessed something that would stay with them, a moment where someone refused to shrink. And when one person does that, it makes it easier for others to stop shrinking too. Jada turned slightly, finally preparing to leave the table, but she didn't rush. There was no embarrassment in her steps, no apology in her eyes. As she walked away, eyes followed her not with pity, but with a kind of reverence. It wasn't hero worship. It wasn't spectacle. It was respect, pure and unfiltered, the kind that comes not from winning, but from refusing to lose your voice when someone tries to take it from you. And all across the restaurant, the air seemed charged with that quiet resistance, like the room itself had chosen a side without anyone needing to say a word. He sat there, unmoving, shoulders drawn inward as if trying to occupy less space, a sharp contrast to the way he had entered, larger than life, commanding, certain of his place in the room. Now, with silence still draped over the table like a second tablecloth, he looked like a man who no longer understood the rules of the game he thought he'd mastered. The silverware in front of him gleamed, untouched, the cocktail with its contested lemon wedge now melting slowly beside his unused napkin. Around him, the Seeger conversation at his table had dried up completely. There was no apology, no deflection, no attempt at charm or recovery. Just that thick, charged silence that falls when someone realizes they are no longer feared and, more importantly, no longer respected, the kind of realization that doesn't come from a shouted argument or a dramatic exit, but from stillness. From being seen clearly and found wanting. He tried to straighten his posture, but it only made his discomfort more visible. The fabric of his tailored suit strained slightly at the shoulders, as though resisting his need to look composed. The other guests didn't boo or heckle. That would have let him off too easily. Instead, they watched. Watching is worse, because it means remembering. A few phones had appeared, discreetly at first, not to film, but to text, notes being sent. Stories already beginning to spread beyond the restaurant walls. Not gossip, a moment shared. A moment where a woman stood still and told the truth, and a man who'd built his name on control had nothing to stand on. In return, two waiters stood by the entrance to the kitchen, arms crossed, not hiding their expressions. One of them whispered something to the hostess, who nodded with a quiet seriousness. It was clear now, Jada was not alone. The people she worked with had heard everything, they had seen it all, and more importantly, they had taken their positions. There's a quiet kind of solidarity that comes from knowing someone in your crew held the line, and you're there to make sure the line doesn't bend. Jada returned to the server station near the bar, placing the tray down with careful precision. She didn't look back at the table, and she didn't need to. One of the bartenders reached out and gently touched her shoulder as he passed, a brief, silent show of support. Another server brought her a glass of water without a word. She accepted it, took a small sip, and resumed her work as though it were any other night. There was no performance in her calm, just the practiced resilience of someone who'd long learned how to move through spaces that didn't expect her to speak back at the billionaire's table. One of his companions finally broke the silence. The woman sitting next to him leaned in and murmured something, low and quick. His response was barely audible, but whatever he said didn't seem to sit well. She stood up slowly, smoothed her skirt, and stepped away from the booth. She didn't wait for the others. Her expression was polite but distant, the kind you wear when you've decided not to be part of someone else's fallout. A minute later, the two men at the table did the same, one after the other, with mumbled excuses and uneasy glances. Within moments, the billionaire was sitting alone. The restaurant hadn't returned to normal. It wasn't going to. There was a charge in the air now, not anger, not tension, but awareness. Everyone who had been in the room would remember the moment in fragments, in still images. The waitress standing tall, the man folding in on himself, the words that had sliced clean through hierarchy. People resumed their meals eventually, but the conversations were different, softer, more careful. As if that one confrontation had reminded them of something they didn't know they'd forgotten. That power doesn't always look like wealth or volume or dominance. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it sounds like one sentence in the corner of the restaurant. The manager emerged, having reviewed the incident from the back, and approached Jada slowly. There was no reprimand in his step. His face carried something between pride and gravity. Staff near the back took notice. Nobody said anything. They didn't have to. Jada met the manager's eyes for just a second and nodded once, not seeking approval, not asking permission, just confirming something both of them already understood. The billionaire remained seated, his hands now in his lap, his gaze fixed somewhere far off, no longer interested in the drink, the food, or the performance of dominance he had come in to deliver. The room had frozen around him once, and it hadn't thawed in his favor. He had money, yes, but money couldn't rewind a sentence, couldn't say a truth, couldn't buy the room back once it had decided who it was really listening to.